Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about my approach to live guitar tone, live guitar playing, just some techniques that I've used over the years. I've been playing in church for about 7-8 years and some other venues for about 10. This is going to be kind of like the first of 2 videos. We're going to do kind of a sister video after this as well, talking about studio tone. We actually just cut all the guitars for an upcoming project for our church, so we're super excited about that, and I'd love to share just some of the stuff I learned along the way. So I've got 3 tips in particular that are going to help maximize that live tone and get us right where we need to be in a mix. So let's go ahead and start with tip number 1. All right, so tip number 1 is going to be something I like to call the 3 to 7 rule, and you can almost think of it as far as like self-compression, if that makes sense. So let's say that on a 1 to 10 scale, you've got 1, you're barely picking, so the note's hardly coming out. And then 10 is you're hitting the guitar so hard that the strings are coming out of tune and all of that. So I try to live within that 3 to 7 range. So even the quietest parts on the guitar, and even if we're kind of in like a flow or spontaneous moment, the quietest things I'm going to play are going to be on like a 3 out of 10 on that scale. And the thought behind that is that anything below a 3 isn't really going to come forward in the mix. And so even if you're playing like a quiet counter melody or something like that, play it confidently, and that'll kind of give the sound guy a good gauge of what your quietest setting is going to be. So you can imagine him, if you give him something super, super quiet, it might be a great part, but you're just playing it really quiet. He might try to boost you in that moment, and then if you kind of dig in a little bit more or put on a boost or an overdrive, all of a sudden you're the loudest thing in the mix. And that's really, really difficult to dial in with all the other instruments. And the same goes for the higher end of that. So we look at kind of that really, really energetic, maybe it's a bridge, maybe you drop into like a big halftime chorus or something like that. I'm never hitting the guitar above like that 7. So the 7 is the most I'm gonna give my guitar, and it's actually the most I'm gonna get out of my guitar. So the harder we actually attack the guitar, the less it's gonna give us over time. So a jump from like something really quiet at that 3 level to like a 5 is gonna be a more significant jump than like an 8 to a 9. Once you're at about that 7 on the guitar, you're not actually gonna get anything more back from the guitar. And what that allows us to do is play those really big parts really, really smoothly and consistently. So you're not kind of jumping out and creating these peaks. You're actually almost self-compressing, kind of like we mentioned earlier. So we'll dive into a couple examples of that. The first one is going to be that No Longer Slaves part that everyone knows. It is a quieter part on the record, but if we play that super, super quiet, it's not going to come through in the mix. So we'll play it really, really quiet the first time, and then we'll kind of come up to that 3 or 4 level on the guitar on the second pass. So you can hear there that when I played really quiet, the notes were actually a little bit muffled, and these are actually the exact same settings on my board. So the only thing that's on is my compression and the delay and reverb, so pretty clean. The only difference was that when I played lighter, the top end of the notes wasn't actually coming out. So yes, you're playing this really pretty quiet part, but the whole EQ of the notes aren't coming out. And that's really, really important when you're playing something quiet. If you lose the top end from not attacking it enough, you're gonna lose the entire note in the mix. All right, so now let's take a look at maybe a larger driven part where we can kind of explore that top end of our attack. So the first clip we're gonna hear is gonna be kind of going above that 7 on that 3 to 7 scale. And we'll kind of hear that it doesn't sound quite as smooth as maybe some of the more driven tones you hear on a record. And for this section, all I'm adding is my Superbolt. So on that first take, we definitely heard like some of the out of tune low notes that were hit when I was really digging in. Keep in mind that you're not getting much more back from your guitar over about 7. So in those 2 clips, you're not hearing like a difference in gain. Again, that was just my Superbolt. But what you're hearing is like an inconsistency in the strumming. You're hearing a couple low notes get hit out of tune, which can happen when you get really aggressive and dig in. So what I like to do in really big parts is kind of let my pedals do the work for me, and then just strum right where I know I'm getting kind of the maximum sustain from the actual strings and the pickups. All right, so tip number 2 is going to be all about compression. So when it comes to live playing and working with a sound guy, you really have to have kind of that open dialogue with that person to make sure, one, you're giving everything he needs as far as EQ, maybe some gain structure, that kind of thing. And then to make sure that the tone you hear in your ears and that you actually want to present is what's coming through. So the way I think about compression is in 2 categories of compression. So the first one being kind of like limiting or the evening out kind of compression, and we might use maybe a pedal or even kind of the preamp stuff for studio use. But I kind of see that as like the classic idea of compression, right? So you want to take those really soft notes and kind of bring those up into the mix, and you want to kind of clip anything that might be really aggressive in the attack, just so again your window goes from here to about here. And what people misunderstand about compression a lot is that, well, it's kind of ruining my dynamics, or it's taking away the dynamics I have. And I think it all comes down to dialing in compression correctly and actually understanding how to use it. So I actually run a lot more compression now than I did maybe even 2 or 3 years ago. And I really like how tight it keeps everything. And along with tip number 1, kind of keeping that 3 to 7 rule, it really gives the sound guys a really consistent tone and something that's really easy to mix. So play around with that, get your compressor pedal kind of wound up maybe a little bit more, and just see how it feels. You don't have to keep it there, but just see how it feels, maybe play a whole song along with it, and just see what it does to your tone. If it kind of tightens it up, if it lifts it. A lot of the compressor pedals today have like a tone knob, maybe notch that back, notch that up for more or less high end, however you want that to work, and just see what it does to that tone. The second kind of compression has more to do with amp saturation or pedal saturation from like a gain pedal. And what that's actually doing, so if you imagine like an AC30 doesn't have all the headroom in the world, it's super loud, but as you push that amp harder, whether that's turning the actual volume on the amp up or hitting it with a boost or an overdrive, that amp is running out of clean headroom. So it's actually not getting louder, it's compressing into that saturated state. And that's a really good place to live, because if you run like a completely clean amp and then hit on like a gain pedal, your dynamics just completely change. Like it's gonna sound really different. So when I'm dialing in, one, a clean tone, and then maybe some dirtier tones with more gain, I'm not wanting to get super saturated to where I'm losing the size of the note, but I am wanting to kind of cascade into that gain level where it's not like one super low notch here and then it completely jumps and sounds like a different tone, and then the third one is super loud and super obnoxious. So I want it to sound like my guitar, my amps, just turned up a little bit more. So I'll turn off all my effects now, and we'll look at what my exact clean tone is, not even the compressor on, and then we'll walk through my gain stages in building a tone. So you can definitely hear there how it kind of builds through the gain range. That was clean, then the compressor, and then the Superbolt, and then my Vertex Boost after that before bringing in all the stereo effects as well. One last part for this, tip number 2, is just watch the gain levels on some of the drives you're using. When you really saturate things, you can actually lose the front end transients of the note. And so in my mind, I kind of think of size in a mix is going to equal attack plus sustain. And so if we have a really, really loud amp, that already takes care of a lot of that sustain for us. Since if we're hitting a tube amp with a lot of volume, it's going to wake up those power tubes, and the preamp tubes are going to get that drive level where you want it. But it's really those power tubes driving kind of that low end power of the amp that are going to give you that really, really great sustain. So what happens is a lot of people will turn on like a really, really loud driven overdrive pedal thinking it sounds great, and it does in isolation. But in a mix, when you put that on, or when you stack 2 or 3 overdrives, you might think it's getting bigger, but it's actually taking away all the front end of that note. So you're just turning into a bunch of loud noise. You're not actually retaining any of that clarity on the front end of the note. So even though my driven tones are really, really loud and really present, they're not overly saturated. So I keep all the gain knobs on my drive pedals, which is the Superbolt, and then the Benson we'll hear in a second. But I keep those below 9 o'clock, maybe at 9 o'clock or just below, just to make sure that when I'm hitting them, I want to push the amp more. I don't want pure pedal overdrive. So if we take that idea of size in a mix equaling attack and sustain, we've kind of got the amp handling like the saturation and all of that. That's going to give us that really, really great sustain without getting too gainy, too saturated. If we look at that attack part, we need to really hone in on how are we attacking the guitar and how much of the front end of the note do we have. So when we add all of that gain and dialing our gain pedals super wide open, that's what we're losing. So even when it sounds great in like a bedroom or something like that, we're actually losing all of that front end transients in a live setting. So what we'll do now is take a guitar part from Alabaster Heart and kind of look at different ways that we can attack that note. First, we'll go kind of the straight up picking, just a normal single string, not hitting any others. And then we'll take a look at a technique where you can actually string rake while muting everything else, and that'll give kind of the feel of more attack. You'll see this in a lot of blues players playing, and what they're doing, they might just be playing 1 note, maybe 2, but the attack of all those other strings while they're still muted makes that note feel a lot bigger. So basically what we heard there was the change in dynamic from picking that straight and having it almost be a little bit cleaner, even though the Superbolt was on the entire time. That was the exact same setting for both parts. So by leaving yourself a bit of headroom, you can also use that muted string technique to just bring a little bit more out of the guitar. All right, so let's talk about wet effects. So tip number 3 is going to be that wet effects, oftentimes when you hear on these records, the guitar players are actually using a little bit less than what you might think. So if you think about how one of these live records is produced, the band is cutting everything up front, and then everything's being produced on the back end by the project lead, project producer. So they're adding in maybe some room mics where you might get bleed from the PA. You might get some vocal reverb that's added in after the fact. You might actually get a little bit more reverb on the guitars or on the keys too. So what you're hearing when you're trying to dial in these exact same kind of effects from these live recordings, you're actually hearing a lot more wet effects than actually is going on in their tone. This isn't a terrible way to kind of really dial in their tone, but the only problem is when we wind up notching in like 1 or 2 extra mix levels of reverb or delay, trying to match what we're hearing on the record when what they're playing is actually a little bit drier. And so if we try to pull that into one of our mixes on like a Sunday or any other live situation, we're actually a little bit further back in the mix because every little bit of reverb that you add is going to bring you further back in a mix. It's a great effect, but when we use that mix a little bit too much, it can definitely push us further back. And don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of delay and reverb and even like mod effects and that kind of thing too, and love the sound and effect that they give to a mix. but we need to be careful about like going overboard with those things too, especially when kind of keys might take that more pad or synth part two, where we're kind of bringing in more of that body to the mix. We can maybe even something as small as like carving out a little bit of the low end from our reverb, or bringing that mix back just a little bit. A good starting point for me on the Big Sky, which I use, is kind of leaving the mix at 12. If I need a little bit more or a little bit less, I kind of have that variability, but I'm not ever really pushing that mix past like 1 o'clock. And that would be kind of a really ambient part, or something that I want to have a lot of energy, but not necessarily be super out front. So if we're thinking about even like the decay of the reverb, the congregation or the audience that you're playing to isn't going to be able to tell that you spent an extra 30 minutes figuring out that the song needed a 5.5 second verb as opposed to like a 4 second verb or something like that. If you find something that fits the song and kind of tails the way you want it to, just kind of have that range between anywhere like 3 if you want something long for a slower song, even push it up to like 6 or something like that. It'll work. And as far as the more important parameter on reverb, definitely look at that mix control to kind of control the amount of reverb that you've got going on. So now we're gonna take the song God of Revival and kind of take that last ascending chorus part for the guitar, and we're gonna dial in a little bit too wet of an effect on the delay and the reverb, and then the second clip will dial that back to where I would play that on a live situation. So even if that first clip actually sounds a little bit better just on its own, it's really going to be pushed back in a live mix. You'll get those notes on their own, like you'll get the tones coming through, but you won't get any of the attack. That'll be really buried, and kind of it'll just be tripping over itself basically. So I always try to make sure that my delay and reverb are a good fit for the song that I'm playing. There's some stuff where if you're playing slide work or anything like that, or if it's kind of a more moving piece, maybe something more spontaneous, yeah, throw on a super wet reverb for like swells or something like that, or if you want to kind of glide up on that slide stuff too. But when you're playing parts that you want to come through, just be aware of how much reverb we're throwing on that. So one last thing too is going to be just communicate with your sound guy, have a good relationship with him, grab him a coffee one Sunday or something like that. Always make sure that you're open with him and that you're giving all the tone you need to him, and making sure also that what's in your head and what you're trying to present to the rest of the band and to the congregation is what's actually coming across. So with the first tip, kind of that 3 to 7 rule, self-compressing, just ask them, hey, am I jumping out at any given point? Am I poking through a little bit too much here? Or is there too much treble in this section? Am I still present enough down here even though it's a quiet part? For tip number 2, using like actual compression pedals and that kind of thing, just ask, hey, do I sound like way too slammed, or does it still sound complete, kind of tight, but still breathing? That's kind of where we want to live. And another thing too is paying attention, hey, can you still hear the front end of my notes? Can you actually hear the clarity that I'm trying to get, or is there too much gain on the note? And the last thing would be just having him kind of double check how the wet effects sound. Is it actually accomplishing what you think it is? Sometimes we can dial things in, maybe at home or in a studio, that sound great again on their own, but in a full band mix might get a little bit lost. So just double check with him, make sure that those big bright effects that you're using on the first song come through and kind of add to that. And then the dark swirly stuff on the longer, slower song add to that effect as well. That's all we've got today. Thanks so much for checking out this video. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe. That helps us out a ton and keeps you up to date with any videos in the future. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we've kind of got like the part 2 or a sister video to this coming out for studio work. Can't wait to dive into that stuff and share that with you. Thanks, guys.